So let us move on to Riverrun. More complaining.
Your other favorite, like you sent notes and you
Yes.
like your notes for this episode were, what was the point of Bravos? What was the point of Riverrun? Right. and then the thing we're going to talk about after, which I am excited about.
Yeah.
So I'm going to keep the hype and make you not think that we're just complaining the whole time.
The other thing wasn't to complain. It was
But Riverrun, we got 2 episodes, and you think 2 episodes too many.
Yeah, it's just the sum total thing, right? Because there was so much in play. Like you look at last week's episode, we were excited about that. Like, oh, the blackfish is back. There's a very interesting sort of moral quandary
How
here.
are they going to get out of it unscathed?
Right.
Oh.
And then it was like, it's interesting because, okay, I guess, the main thing here that it did is sort of basically remind you of Jaime's, love of Cersei, and we did talk early in the season, right? We did talk about how we felt like Jaime was kind of a weird, murky place. Like we weren't quite sure what his drive was anymore, right?
Right.
And I guess this episode was said his drive is actually Cersei again. It's like it never really went away, even though there were times where they were at odds and this and that. So this episode was saying no, it's still Cersei, and I guess I liked, even though it was kind of weird in the moment, to be like, okay, yeah, he'll still do terrible things because he's so in love with his sister, because of his incestuous love of his sister. He'll like turn on a dime and have sort of a bonding, what seemed like he was trying to have a bonding conversation, turn into like, I will kill your baby. So I thought that was interesting in and of itself, but everything else that happened in Riverrun ended up kind of going back to it didn't really need to happen.
Right. I mean, I think part of it is just like an excuse to develop Jaime, because the Dorne storyline, for all that, like, he did get that moment with Myrcella at the end, and I think we've decided off camera that's largely what has motivated him this season and drawn him back to Cersei, was having this loss with his daughter when he finally had that moment of being a father,
right.
and that pushed them back together. But the Dorne storyline did such a terrible job, I think, of giving Nikolai Coster-Waldau and Jaime like meaty material that I think they need an excuse to get him out of King's Landing, which is the main reason they did this. But I will say, the stuff, whether or not it was important in the scheme of things, the scenes with Jaime in this episode I thought were incredibly well done and incredibly well written. I thought it was interesting and I keep hyping this interview with Nikolai Coster-Waldau, but it's like my favorite thing that I've done, because I found out he's like the biggest Jaime and Brienne shipper, and he basically like wrote me fanfic, but it's not fanfic because that's how he was playing it, where he was just like, yeah, like what he told me is that he is in love with Brienne, and he totally would want to be with her in the way that Bronn was suggesting, but he can't because it's another like love he can never consummate, which is sort of what he has with Cersei. And I think that comes across a lot in their scene together. Right.
With Cersei,
right. I think that comes across a lot in their interaction. He even has this great thing he said to me, which is when, Jaime makes Brienne keep the sword, and he's like, it's yours. Nikolai said, it's Jaime's way of saying, keep my heart. It will always be yours, which I was like, like, really? Okay, but which is so interesting when it then goes to that scene with him and Edmure, and Jaime says, everything I do for Cersei. I love Cersei. And for a minute, I was just like, are you lying to yourself about how deep your affection for your sister runs and why it is? And I also asked Nikolai, because this is a question we had, which is like, why, after all the changes we've seen Jaime undergo, after all the time he spent away with Cersei, why did he just go back to her and stay with her? And he said it's because family is the most important thing to him at this point. So I'm curious to see. In a gross way. I mean, we're like 6 seasons into the.
So now we're so used to the incest.
Like the most popular incest relationship of all time that it's like socially acceptable on Game of Thrones for us to talk about it. I'm very curious to see what happens to the Lannisters as a family. We talked about this before a little bit. If the family is shattered, if the third child of Cersei dies and there isn't anything really to protect, what does that do for the one thing that Jaime has left to root for? Anyway, that was a really long way of saying I thought that the writing for Jaime this episode was really great between those two big scenes, and it worked for me.
And I'll say you're definitely right. Like those were good Jamie scenes, and
Tobias Menzies was like, he finally got to talk.
He got to talk. You didn't bring him back
good.
to not talk. And then and I brought up earlier, I really liked the Braun pod scene, which came from this storyline. So it's like there were good moments, but it is mostly I do feel it felt like, and again, we were talking to Jim Vejvoda before we came in here, and he's like, you don't know. Like, right, maybe there's something more we're not seeing here. But right now it feels like actually plot-wise, they were basically kind of just moving people around until they go back where they were, right?
I think
Jamie left King's Landing,
taking people out of the picture.
Brienne left Sansa because Brienne failed to get any help, The Blackfish came back. We're like, oh, cool, the Blackfish came back. He's so awesome last week, and now he's dead. I really wish he'd gotten that boat with Brienne, I felt like even if she came back with just the Blackfish, that would have been kind of a cool new element to throw into the mix, and what does he bring with him as far as his knowledge and background? Because, it does seem that 2 episodes at Riverrun, which seem really cool setup, at the end of it, it's just like, okay, that was an incident where plot-wise, you're right, it's like some good character beats, but plot-wise, it felt like it could have happened off camera. Like, Jamie succeeded in getting Riverrun back, that could have happened.
And I agree. And I did like the Blackfish's line about how, I ran at the Red Wedding, I'm not going to run again, which I respect. Like, he is, as Jamie said, he's an old man. All he has left is an honorable death. I think there were 2 missteps in the way that was handled, which is what you were alluding to with the Wave's death happening off screen. One, the Blackfish deserves an honorable death. Yeah. Don't let it happen off screen. I asked the director, I'm like giving away my entire interview, but I asked him why. Why did you have this happen off screen? He said it was in the script, but the writer's intent was it would like take away from the point of the scene, and he sort of was like, the samurai warrior who went down fighting. But I think that they misjudged not only the popularity of that character and the fact that like there are a few honorable deaths, deserving deaths on Game of Thrones. I think to see him, even a quick moment of him going down fighting would have been really powerful and a nice way to end that long Red Wedding storyline that we're seeing come to an end. But also the misstep of people don't believe that a character is dead.
Right.
If we don't see them die on Game of Thrones. And I fully believe that the Blackfish did die, even though we didn't see him.
I was actually arguing with Fowler about this because he thought maybe.
But that's the thing. And I mean, even when we see people die, they aren't always dead on Game of Thrones. So I think those were 2 mistakes, and that did leave sort of like a sour taste in my mouth. Even though I loved like the cute little wave goodbye as Jamie let Brienne and Pod go.
I think it was just that in one episode we had Dany sort of saved the day off camera. We had the waif die off camera, and we had the Blackfish die off camera. And it was just too much in one episode. Even though we both liked the waif thing particularly, like felt like that worked in its, what it was doing. It was just in the one episode to have so much happening. It just felt like too much.
The balance of these scenes, like as much as we haven't even gotten to the Hound and the Brotherhood, but like those are scenes that took a decent chunk of the episode, and like these great like 2 character conversation scenes, or 3 in the case of Terri and Miss Anthony Grey, where I'm like, those are great. But I really like those. Those are my favorite parts of this episode. But it does just feel out of balance with these other things that you're cutting at the expense of those longer scenes. And I mean, I'm not. This is why I commentate and I write. Right. Like, I'm not a director. I'm not a writer on a TV show. I don't have those answers. But it did just feel out of balance to me.
That was the main thing to me. Again, watching a show that I love. It's weird. I'm going to make a weird comparison here between this episode of Game of Thrones and X-Men Apocalypse. As someone who actually has enjoyed all the other Bryan Singer X-Men movies, I was watching X-Men Apocalypse. I'm like, something's off. Like the first 20 minutes, it's like whatever I felt clicked in the other Singer X-Men movies isn't here. And that's a little bit what I felt with Game of Thrones this week. Again, on a show that I absolutely think is great. It's just like there was something like the balancing act of things. And of course, it's this huge undertaking they're doing. And just this episode, I think there was, when there's so many plot points happening at once, I think, that's got to be one of the biggest challenges to making the show, right? Is that it's so spread out. It's such a big world, so many characters. And just the simple thing of all 3 of those things happening off camera, in the same episode, right? They might have worked spread out and slightly handled differently, but when they happen one after the other,
Right.
you're kind of like, okay.
I think that was why we had the same problem before, that we got a bit of flack from people, which is funny because we're going to go into a big theory that we have. But the whole idea of like 3 episodes in a row, revealing fan theories that have existed for years,
Yes.
pretty much exactly as people expected, like 1 or 2, but it was just, 3 is a trend, and that felt off for us. But yeah, I'm already ready for the flack that we're going to get for the theory that we dive into after last week. We were talking about how all the theorizing is like ruining elements of Game of Thrones.
Hey, that's what we're here for.
Yeah, we're here for your anger, internet.
Well, let us know, what did you think though of the Riverrun storyline? Did you think it was worth it? Did you as far as we were talking about the character scenes, or did you feel like story-wise that could have happened off camera? So let us know. And the Blackfish coming back, I think that's a big one. Would you like to have seen more with the Blackfish in his return? And do you think he's really dead? He's dead.
He's dead.
I think he's dead.